mixed it and played with it, and I mixed it a lot, and I came very familiar with the song. And I played it a lot, and Brian would hear it, because his bedroom was above the studio, and he would hear it. And eventually it came down, and eventually started working with it, and he worked with it a lot. He was never satisfied with it. It seemed like he was always changing and erasing this or adding that. Eventually it came out, but even after it came out, he was still working with it. And he just loved that song.
Wilson's efforts went unnoticed by domestic audiences, however, and the single failed to break the Billboard Top 40 and to raise their profile. In Europe, the band were playing packed venues in front of an audience who truly appreciated the post-Smile material. But at home, the Beach Boys had lost their appeal. Desperate to improve the situation, the band contacted their old concert promoter, Fred Vail, to help them reconnect with their lost audience.
Carl called me and he said, we're making some management changes out here. He said, your name came up and we'd love to have you consider rejoining the organization. Because it was a tough time for the Beach Boys. All was not great. All was not, you know, what it had been. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And it really was. Brian, he was taking a little bit of a back seat, but he was also becoming much more reclusive. So when I finally come back out, and it's June of 1969, you know, there is a little bit of a change in Brian. He's more withdrawn and a little bit more, I honestly felt he was a little bit more insecure. You know, greed and the money versus personal ambition and personal passion and wanting to move on. It was, you know, the perfect storm.
With Wilson's link to his muse severed by the financial concerns of the Beach Boys, his more ambitious and less commercial interests found an outlet elsewhere. Young poet Stephen Kalinich, who had been signed to Brother Records back in 1967, had since become close to the Wilson family, and with the band busy touring, Brian developed a new project with this writer. With the home studio at hand for these experiments, they began recording Kalinich's spoken word poetry, with Wilson's original compositions and backing vocals.
I think that Brian wanted to do alternative things. I also think, and I don't mean this unkindly because I've become friends with all of them, I think that there probably was pressure to stay with commercial kind of Beach Boy things, and I probably was not an artist that was very commercial. But I think he was genuinely stirred and moved. We never talked about a hit or any, I mean, obviously this is not the kind of thing, but we were excited with the galactic poems, with the symphonies, with America, and doing things, and it was such a joyful experience.
America, I know you. I feel your open spirit. I roam in your open meadows. I taste the oranges from your orange tree. I smell the blossoms of your pear.
There's so much about this time. Precious, dear, Brian not thinking commercially, being artistic, being spiritual, being open to life, almost recognizing that whatever we were doing felt like a gift. He helped me organize it, weed out what didn't need to be there. He was an active part in this thing. And he gave me the support. And we did it together. When Brian sang Lonely Man in the studio with that high falsetto, and let me tell you of a lonely man. And he got me to go my natural voice, who lived, it sounds like the Middle Ages to me, or the Renaissance. And he did those high notes, and a lot of it's cut out, the way they mixed it down. My God, like I get chills in my body. Are you an egomaniac? No, it's almost like we didn't write it.
Let me tell you of a lonely man who lived many, many years ago. And he searched for a love in a distant land, and he didn't know where to go.
Lonely Man, he searched here and there and everywhere. It's kind of like Brian, the love he could not find. He searched in Canada and Spain and in Italy, around Gibraltar and near the Red Sea, and the love was there. It was everywhere, and the love he did not see. It was in the flower in the meadow, the brook running by the sea, the apple in the orchard, the cherry on the tree. You know, I mean, the lonely man is no longer, and the heavens they did open, the light came shining down, and there's no longer any lonely man around. He was excited. He liked listening to me recite. He was so into it. He was calling everybody, the heads of record companies, Mo Austin, to try and help me get a placement. He had a real passion for it, and I think he went with his own gut, and probably did not get much support.
Unable to generate any interest in the project, it was eventually abandoned, resurfacing decades later. Yet at a time when he was without a clear sense of purpose, these experiments highlighted that as an outsider in his own band, the composer still needed others for inspiration and encouragement.
I think Brian artistically hungered for a quantum leap of spirituality, that because sometimes all the material success and people loving you, if you don't feel right within yourself, I think Brian was still searching for the road to himself.
I think he was wanting to feel needed, wanting to feel appreciated, wanting to know that what he was doing had purpose. Brian would call me up at 10, 11 o'clock. Fred, what are you doing? Oh, I'm watching TV, getting ready to go to bed. Oh, I got a song, I want to run it by you, you know. And come on out, you know, there's nobody here. I want to play it for you. I want your response, I want your reaction, you know, I want your input, whatever. So I'd hop in the car and drive out to Bel Air, which was, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes or so away. And Brian would talk and play me some songs, and then just kind of just fiddle around, and, you know, and all of a sudden it'd be 2 o'clock in the morning, and Brian had gotten up at 4 or 5, and, you know, he was just, you know, reaching his peak, you know, and I've been up since 7 o'clock in the morning, you know, and I knew I'd have to be up in the next morning at 7, and, you know, by the time I finally would say, well, Brian, I gotta get home, I gotta get some sleep, and I got a lot on my plate tomorrow, and, you know, I didn't want to leave him, but at the same time, I was, you know, a couple nights I was exhausted.
Yet these compositions that Brian had been working on would form a major part of the Beach Boys' next release. At the end of November 1969, after struggling to find a suitable deal, the band eventually signed to Reprise Records, a subsidiary of Warner Brothers. Immediately after negotiations were complete, they performed a short North American tour, and in keeping with their recent domestic fortunes, it was dismally attended. Yet the band were excited about their new label, had begun working on a clutch of new songs, and Brian himself got caught up in the enthusiasm surrounding him. Unable to shake off their outdated image while on Capitol, with their first Warner's release, the band knew that expectations were running high, and that they had to move into the new decade as a reinvigorated unit.
I was keenly aware of the importance of this album. The Beach Boys are looked at as the establishment. I mean, they're still looked at as that group that wear the white pants and the striped shirt. Even though they weren't wearing white pants and striped shirt, they were still considered the band of the establishment, and they're going up against a counterculture. And it was basically a little bit of a battle, so to speak. You know, do they continue to pump out the very establishment, very commercial hits that they had, you know, 63 to 67, or do they go forward? Do they start to take on new musical challenges, reinvent themselves, so to speak?
It was a time of growth, a time of evolution for the Beach Boys. It was a very creative time, and Brian was right in there too. All the experimenting, the fact that they were coming into their own as musicians and as writers, the whole thing blossomed.
Not only did the new sessions see an increase in Brian Wilson's contribution in terms of songwriting, it also saw him step back into a more hands-on production role.
Working with Brian was exhausting because Brian was fast. It was all I could do to keep up with Brian. I was amazed at how few takes Brian used for himself or others. He was a 1 or 2 takes, and that was it. And it was all he needed. He was so good at singing. He didn't need to keep doing it over and over and punch in and everything. But he would do that with other people if necessary, especially instrumental tracks, to get it right. But if he was adding a part, if he was playing a guitar, if he was playing the organ or something, 1 or 2 takes was all he needed.
A finished album was quickly delivered to Warner Reprise. Yet despite Brian's increased presence, the label were unable to hear clear hits and insisted that the band return to the studio to strengthen the record. One song, however, a composition by Wilson and Mike Love, did strike them as strongly commercial. Add Some Music to Your Day was rush-released in late February 1970 as a taster for the forthcoming album. But for all the high hopes of everyone involved that this would secure them a return to the top flight, the single underperformed.
I don't think the media was too gung-ho on the record because there were so many outside artists and the whole era, the whole counterculture thing, they were up against that, and it was a very, very difficult task.
It's kind of interesting as to why the song Add Some Music was originally going to be the Sunflower album title. I mean, everybody really, really believed in this particular song. At the same time, this is a period where lyrics are the most important thing in a song. And, you know, the lyrics are nice, too nice. It's just, you know, it becomes a bit saccharine. Anybody who had long hair down to their shoulders and a beard and is thinking about stopping the draft in the Vietnam War is thinking that's dentist office music. So what I don't understand is these guys who are running Warner Brothers Records at the time, who are managing the Jimi Hendrix Experience and the Grateful Dead and all these other groups, thinking that that was going to be such a big deal. And maybe Brian Wilson believed in that as being a big deal. And maybe he didn't recognize what was going on. The kind of song that had lyrics that might have communicated at that time was This Whole World, which Brian had written. It's About Time, which Dennis had written. These are sentiments the Beach Boys are expressing, the same sentiments the counterculture was expressing.
I'm thinking about this whole world. Late at night I think about the love of this whole world. Lots of different people everywhere.
This Whole World is a good example of a really solid Brian Wilson song that would be good in any period by any standard. This Whole World is also a good example of him really experimenting with keys in a way that he did much earlier, like in Pet Sounds and other things. It starts in C, and now somehow we're in A. Now we get to C sharp or D flat, and then we get a descending bass. Now we're in B flat. And we're back in C. So somehow we got from C to A, to D flat, to B flat, and finally back to C. If I play the keys like that, they sound like they don't belong together, like you couldn't actually make a song that uses those keys and sounds coherent. But as always, the way he gets from one to the other is just masterful.
That Wilson was back on form was seemingly confirmed by the clutch of other songs that he contributed to the album. And on the surface, Sunflower promised a new period of productivity from a reinvigorated artist.
You have a sense that this guy is back at work. I mean, certainly if you view it through the limited lens of what seemed to be going on in 1970, you could pick up that album and you would think to yourself, Brian Wilson is back on, is back on the ball. It's a different band, it's a new era, but Brian is definitely first among equals here. And that's a very heartening thing to think in 1970. And people, certainly critics and people who were hip to that kind of sound, or into that kind of music at the time were overjoyed because it was and remains a really, really good album.
Brian, to a degree, was back, but he never was back 100% because they'd all taken on new roles.